We're just going to switch out the stage a bit. So while we do that, I'm going to have the pleasure of introducing our keynote speaker for this morning. Jacqueline Welsh is the Chief HR Officer and Chief Diversity Officer at Freddie Mac, though she self-describes as a wife and mother who works outside the home. She is wife to Tarek Welsh and a mother to 2 young men, James and Jackson. And she's also a mom to her little fur baby, Benjamin Bones, and is a fan of Game of Thrones. Jackie is a relauncher who temporarily left the workforce on 2 different occasions to care for her family and to practice self-care. She also has been journaling since she was a teen. Writing down her stories helps her appreciate the stories of others. Today, she'll be sharing some of those stories, and last night I got a taste of what an inspiring speaker she is, so we are in for a treat. Please join me in welcoming Jackie to the stage. Good morning for you.
Okay, thank you. Good morning. Did y'all just hear that I'm a journaler? So that kind of lukewarm response will absolutely get you in my journal, and probably not in the most favorable way. So I'm going to try again just to give you all a running start as characters in the journal tonight. Good morning. Good morning. A little better. How about the over and under? Who's going to kill Cersei on Game of Thrones? Arya, Jamie? I'm all in on Jamie. It's Jamie. I'm there. Well, good morning, everyone. It really is a great pleasure to be with all of you all. It's always nice to be with practitioners who share your passion for the topic of people in the workplace. So on that basis alone, I'm tremendously delighted to be here, and certainly amongst peers that, again, share the passion. I want to thank Debbie for that introduction, for humoring me with the introduction. In the spirit of truth and storytelling, I actually asked that I be introduced in a way that was beyond name, rank, and serial number, in the spirit of being human. And in the spirit of how the sausage is made, I made that ask because I really do believe that this is about the humans in these organizations, and so many of you have alluded to that in your prior presentations. And besides that, we're all pretty equally similarly situated in terms of where we are in our career, and all that stuff is out on LinkedIn and where else on the internet it lives, so I didn't really think there would be a need for it to be repeated here. Now let's see, I'm thinking if I advance like this. Or maybe I don't. We didn't go over this part, so bear with me as I figured out, oh, that's a clicker, that's kind of cool. There we go. Somebody else did that, just to be clear. Whoever that was, thank you. So that's all about my conviction about we're all different people, right? So every human being, every adult human being has roughly 206 bones in their body. So in that way, we're very much the same. Even though anatomically we're very much the same, though we all have a very different set of fingerprints. So in my mind, how we introduce ourselves is the way that we leave our fingerprint on people and on things. So again, thank you very much for humoring me relative to how I was introduced. So the other thing about the human experience is that we all enjoy storytelling, right? Caves have encryptions on walls. Every faith tradition has things written down in some form or fashion. Before there was television, there was a fire where I imagine stories were told. And even now, with the distribution of content being different, the idea is still we gather around something to hear tales. While in New York recently, I was in the back seat of a taxi cab and watched almost an entire episode of Entertainment Tonight television and thought, I'm in a cab watching television, which just kind of boggles the mind a little bit. I explained to my children that mommy's old enough to remember when there were 3 national stations, a public station, and TV went off. And they look at me like, what do you mean? I mean, TV went off. There was a national anthem, a moment of silence, color bars, and then snow. And it was a wrap until 7 a.m. and they still look at me like, okay, if you say so. So again, storytelling, critical to who we are, and I'm going to endeavor today to share some stories from work that really tell the tale of what we're doing in the discipline of inclusion and diversity. That reminds me, in terms of people, I have the good pleasure to be joined here by several humans that work for Freddie Mac alongside me. So y'all please wave to the people. Thank y'all for coming. All right, so the first story I want to tell you actually takes place before 1970, or after 1970. I joined Freddie Mac, what will be 3 years ago in December. And one of the first stories that took place, I must have been with the company, I don't know, 2 weeks at the time. And I went into the restroom and I was washing my hands when another woman entered the restroom and she was visibly upset. She was teary-eyed. I got her some tissue and she just sort of said to no one, or to me at first, I was like, what's wrong? Are you okay? What can I do to help you? She had just lost her mother. This is a woman who is from India, which I found out after. But she said, you know, my mom's passed and I'm not certain what I'm going to do in terms of the time off that's going to be required to get there, take care of the arrangements, and come back. Now, it's important to say I must have been there for about 2 weeks. So this woman shared this story with me from a place of great vulnerability and from being distraught, right? That would probably be different now. Joseph, who's our communication strategist in HR, at his suggestion and others, I now blog monthly. And so every single month when the blog comes out, literally my face is plastered everywhere. So I'm saying that to say this woman wouldn't have known that I was head of HR because that had not yet happened. Now people see me going up and down escalators and the blog pictures will be up and they look at the picture, then they look at me, and they look at the picture and they look at me. And this is often on escalators and all I can think is workers' comp claim, right? Like, watch where you're going. But this woman wouldn't have known all of this, and here is she tells me this story. Well, jump forward almost 3 years, and in fact, effective this year, we've increased our bereavement leave to 10 days. Because this is a woman who's on the continent or has family in the continent of India. It's going to take her 2 days to get there. It's going to take her 2 days to come back. Freddie Mac is a majority-minority company, mostly led by Asians. She probably isn't the only individual of that profile. And our prior disability or bereavement leave was only 3 days. And we all know that people grieve differently. Some faith traditions require far more than 3 days. And some of us, just by proximity of the relationship, would require more than 3 days to pull ourselves back together enough to come to work. So that's an example of where having this symbiotic listening relationship with the people who work in the organization alongside you can inform policy. So that's story number one. But now getting back a little bit to who we are, Freddie Mac. 1970, beyond being the year of my birth. I don't mind telling people my age. I know some people don't do that, but I do it all the time. The alternative is worse. So back in 1970 is when Freddie Mac was founded. We are an organization chartered by Congress. And you got to think about what 1970 was, right? So at that point in our history, the average cost of a home in the US, anybody want to guess? South of that, I have a bid for 35.
25.
North of that, one more.
25.
Third, or $24,000. Whoever said that is the winner of nothing, but you were right. $24,000. Inside the homes, these $24,000 homes, presumably people were watching the Jackson 5 on TV. They had a show back then. You've got Jimi Hendrix was a big time radio star. You got shows like Gunsmoke. Anybody remember Gunsmoke? Sanford and Son. Dinner table conversations. You think about what 1970 was on the back end of a very turbulent decade of civil unrest and protests. Leading up to the 1970s, we had JFK's New Frontier, the intent of which was to eliminate injustice and inequality in the US. This later became the Great Society under Lyndon Johnson. Same aim of specific strategies like Medicare, Medicaid, Head Start, Job Corps, model cities, and the like, all looking at things like urban development, community development, and housing. Then you had a lot of civil unrest, right? As much as we think we're in a roiled environment now, in the 60s, it reads like one way to deal with political conflict was literally to assassinate people. You had the assassinations of JFK, MLK, Bobby Kennedy. You had the Stonewall riots in New York City, which was really the foray into rights for members of the LGBT community. You had all sorts of acts like the Civil Rights Act, the Equal Pay Act, and people were in the streets, quite literally fighting and protesting for a better environment. There's a book called The Other America by Michael Harrington. It's an absolute must-read that puts into context all the things that came in the 70s, like Freddie Mac, which again was chartered by Congress. So you get the gist of the environment. And essentially what we do is make home possible. 1 in 5 homes or 1 in 4 homes in the United States for first-time home buyers have gone through the Freddie Mac system. So this is a very fitting backdrop in terms of where our history is around this whole idea of inclusion and diversity. We are quite literally chartered to ensure that marginalized individuals in society have the opportunity to own a home, which, as we all know, is part of the great American dream. So I share that origin story because it highlights why diversity and inclusion has always been embedded in the DNA of Freddie Mac. It also sets the stage for what I'm about to say next. Diversity and inclusion are more than business imperatives, they're right priorities. All right, because we hear that a lot about the business case, etc. And while I don't disagree with the need to contextualize the work that we do, I had the good pleasure of hearing Lena Meir speak. She's the CHRO of Unilever. She was on a panel and someone said, well, what's the business case for women inside of organizations? And she just looked annoyed and she goes, when you find me the business case for men inside of organizations, I will think about developing one for women. So she became my instant hero in that moment because I was like, that's it right there. But that really is broadly applicable. It's not just a business imperative, it's just what it is, right? So that's a little bit of context. One other thing I didn't say at the start, all the pictures you'll see are actual Freddie Mac employees, no stock photography. Just again, in the spirit of humans at Freddie Mac, makes me so happy. I mean, I thought it was such a revolutionary act. I was like, I don't want any more stock photos. There's 6,800 people who work here, take their picture. So it happened. But again, it's important for people to see themselves in the organization and think about when your executives and whomever go out to make presentations about them and they're not in the representation. Small thing, but hugely important, right? So that's a takeaway that wasn't in the notes. I know, sorry. Okay, so what I'd like for you all to do is, I'm not going to make you do any exercises, but think about a time when you didn't feel included. Maybe I went too far too fast, sorry, should go back. All right, so Freddie Mac. So right now in our journey, I do think that D&I, and we call it IND, I do think it's an evolutionary process. And where we are right now relative to our process is that we've really stopped the focus on diversity. As I said at the top end, we are a majority-minority company. A full 36% of our population identify, and this is self-reported data, identify as non-white. In terms of gender, we're almost 50% split between men and women. So we don't have an issue with representation. What we're focused on now is for that 36% of the population that identifies as non-white, and for the women in the organization, are we actually including them in the way that we go to market and make home possible for many Americans? So we have literally switched the focus. And this is not it's important for me to say that we haven't done this at the exclusion of making sure that our pipeline remains robust. That's still a focus. We're still looking for non-traditional sources of talent. We're still very focused on making sure that we have representation at HBCUs as one example, but we're also equally, if not more, focused on how are we tapping into the existing diversity in such a way that people feel included, they feel authentic, and they can do the work that we've hired them to do. So again, looking at inclusion and not just diversity. Okay, so an inclusive mindset delivers meaningful results. We've talked a lot during the conference thus far about this need for mindsets. This is another takeaway I hope you hear relative to the idea of competencies, and all those things are fantastic. And I know this isn't in the script either, Joseph, but a fool with a tool is still a fool. So you can have all kinds of great technology, you can have all kinds of great processes and procedures, but if the mindsets of the individuals with whom you give these tools to do their work isn't such that they embrace it, understand it, committed to it, rewarded for it, or not, then nothing changes. So this is really about a mindset. So now I'm going to ask the question, take a second to think about a time when you felt most included. How did it make you feel? Did your sense of belonging increase your productivity? I'm going to hazard a guess that most likely yes for most of you. Last year, we brought together employees, diverse suppliers, and our community partners for our first ever Inclusion Summit. We used this forum to ask these questions as part of a design thinking activity to address how we could be more inclusive at Freddie Mac. Here begins more storytelling. Each of these stories that I'm going to share with you are framed with the 3 tips we feel necessary to have and operate with what we call the inclusive mindset. Again, going back to mindsets. The first one is you must have the courage to ask important, actionable questions. Again, you must have the courage to ask the important, actionable questions. That would be number 1. Number 2, you must make inclusion a leadership principle. All right, so when you think about who you're hiring into the organization, oftentimes we're stuck in a mindset that talks about culture fit. But if our intention is to evolve, to transform the work that we do, but on the other hand, we're saying, let's hire someone who's going to fit in here now, we've already stymied any potential progress. So we have to have a mindset of what is it that we're trying to evolve to, and then hire people that share that mindset. So move away from this idea of culture fit and think more about culture add. Who's going to add to the culture that we're evolving to? And then the third one is you must take necessary action to search for and address biased systems. Somebody on the panel before talked about the fact that you've got to test the systems, right? Bias can only show to the degree that the systems allow it to. So we can go after individual thinking all day long, but if the systems that are in place are still biased in terms of how they're designed and how they're deployed, again, we stymie any progress right at the starting gate. So again, asking the tough, important, actionable questions, making inclusion a leadership principle, and then taking the necessary actions to pressure test your systems to see where the bias may or may not be. So that's the premise of all the storytelling from this part as point forward. Okay. How can we, Freddie Mac, be more inclusive of people with autism? My first story begins in 2012. A former Freddie Mac executive read a news article about how college-educated people with autism were having a difficult time finding full-time employment. She asked the question, number 1, asked the tough, difficult questions, how can we be more inclusive of people with autism? The question prompted 2 members of our senior team to disclose that they actually had children who were on the spectrum, and together they provided the support to create an intern initiative for people with autism. Someone asks a tough question, create an environment where people go, actually that fits my family situation, voila, quite literally, you get a group of people that say we can do something to take action against this. To launch this initiative, we educated our neurotypical employees on how to be more inclusive of their new colleagues. Quite frankly, we found the learnings we provided were applicable for neurotypical employees as well. Just good human practices. We also examined our own processes to ensure we were being more inclusive. Really quite simple things. We might ask, or you may send interview questions in advance to someone on the spectrum, for example, because that real-time processing under pressure can be difficult. We want people with autism to have opportunities to build their careers, and as business leaders, we need their talent and their skills, especially as individuals with autism are largely an untapped source of talent. Somebody else earlier this morning talked about the fact that it was Elliot, there are 8 billion people on the planet, and yet we are experiencing and will continue to experience a shortage of talent. So we have this population that we know have skills and abilities. We need to be thinking about how do we mainline them into our organizations. We're now expanding our efforts to be more inclusive of neurodiversity across the spectrum to include things like dyslexia. Simple things like that are one example of what we're doing in that space. Okay, what's your salary history? Lots of to-do around that. A couple of years ago, New York City made it illegal to ask salary history on the interview. Obviously, because we operate an office out of New York City, Freddie Mac had to comply with the law. We are primarily domiciled over in Northern Virginia, but maintain offices in New York, Chicago, Dallas, Atlanta, and LA. We could have very easily said, that's New York, we'll do that in New York, but rather than isolate the potential to have larger impact and make progress, we made that the rule of the land across the entire Freddie Mac enterprise. The second thing we do, though, is a point of complete pride for all of us, is we also disallowed the practice of asking for prior salary history for internal candidates. So obviously HR knows everything, but if I am hiring someone from a different department, I am not privy to what they're making in that different department. The data proves conclusively that binding people to their prior salary history pretty much guarantees that they'll never be able to catch up in terms of their marketplace value. And that disproportionately impacts women and minorities. We know this, the data conclusively proves this. And so we've taken a step again, comply with the law, but even though it's not required across the entire United States, we make it required across Freddie Mac, and we've gone the extra step to make it a requirement internally as well. This is yet another example of look at your systems, right? So there's a piece of information that's probably applicable to all of us. So I would suggest to you all, put some pressure on your organizations, right? It's not required where we operate, but why wouldn't we do it? That's one thing you could take away and do starting from today, one challenge for you. So that's one example of systems. Moving on to the next. What can we do, or what don't we know about LGBT homeowners and renters? This is another example of an employee, a member of our team, the HR team, who asked a very provocative question around, what do we know about this potential home buying market? This question prompted her to partner with our Pride Employee Resource Group and several of our business line divisions to commission a first-of-its-kind study to better understand the LGBT housing experience in the U.S. It was her inclusive mindset that prompted her to ask that very tough question. And asking a tough question put us firmly on the path of better understanding this demographic and their needs as potential home buyers and renters. Now this one has a really nice and real current sweet ending. Yesterday, literally yesterday, Senator Susan Collins from Maine and Angus King, also from Maine, introduced the Fair and Equal Housing Act of 2019, which would add gender identity and sexual orientation to the Fair Housing Act's list of protected classes. They cite studies that say same-sex applicants are more likely to be denied a mortgage than heterosexual couples. That's a quote from the press release. Co-sponsoring the legislation are 10 Democratic senators, including Senators Tim Kaine of the Great Commonwealth of Virginia. I have to say this, Freddie Mac does not lobby. I'll say it again, Freddie Mac does not lobby. As a condition of our conservatorship, we don't lobby. Please don't go around saying I said we lobby. That will surely get me kicked out of the place fast and you can say, where'd you go? So we don't lobby. However, we have it on good authority that our research was used as source material for the development of this act. One employee asks a question, we take the resources available to us, we answer that question, and now we have a piece of legislation that might bring more people into the American dream of home ownership. And that happened yesterday when this was already done. The speech was already done. I was like, wait, retract the speech. We have breaking news. So I'm very proud of this. How do we broaden and deepen our impact on diverse suppliers? Again, this is really in the spirit of how do we make the table longer? When you have a role like Chief Diversity Officer or any role inside of an organization, the temptation is to stay very narrowly, rightly, but very narrowly focused on what's happening with your employees. But we've really been pushing ourselves to reach higher and extend further to include more and more people at a longer table. So this question really is designed with that mindset in our mind. We've challenged ourselves to extend our inclusion ambitions past our employees to include our diverse suppliers. Another one of our colleagues asked the question, how do we broaden and deepen our impact on diverse suppliers? The outcome was the launch of the Freddie Mac Vendor Academy, a learning and development initiative targeted at diverse suppliers. So we look at women, minority, LGBT, sort of non-traditionally owned businesses, and the program goes over 5 months. And essentially, now this is what I should have said on the outset, is on the annual basis, Freddie Mac probably spends in the area of $124 to $125 million in external suppliers. And we exceed our goal of 20% of that spend fairly routinely. So we have a metric But just because you're meeting your goals doesn't mean you can't do more, right? We can't make up spend. And so this really became a question of how can we broaden the impact? So the Academy, we thought, well, we don't want to be the only source of potential work for diverse suppliers, because that has a limit. There's only so much we're going to do in the marketplace. But what if we created content that these diverse suppliers could use in their business development outside of Freddie Mac, right? It's the whole adage of give a fish versus teach a person how to fish. So we created this 5-month program. We developed the content. Much of it is developed by Freddie Mac folks and delivered by Freddie Mac folks. There's an application process. We take between 20 and 25 people with each class. It's done by discipline. So we had a legal vendor academy, an IT vendor academy. We're currently doing one inside our single family business. And for 5 months, the participants get to learn about what's the business landscape, what would make them more appealing to people doing work in those stovepipes, in those disciplines. And then at the end of the 5 months, they do a capstone presentation. I'm happy to tell you that almost 44%-ish of people who've gone through our program have done business with Freddie Mac. We haven't tracked, but we're going to start where else they go and do business. So again, it's less about doing business solely with Freddie Mac and more about giving these folks the tools they need to be successful even beyond Freddie Mac. How can they be successful with other government or government-sponsored entities? So that's another way that we think about, again, beyond our employees, what's available to us to really advance this idea of inclusion and diversity. Okay. Continuing with this idea of what can we do outside the four walls of Freddie Mac, we look at community, right? Freddie Mac exists inside of communities. Our employees live inside of communities. So now we have this idea of what can we do about the communities or to support the communities where we live and work. So in all my previous stories, I shared some real stories of how HR, we address bias systems. But for this last story, I want to pivot and highlight a different reason why inclusion matters. This is the Ochon family. Well, the Ochon family. Sergeant Jimmy, as he's affectionately known, is a military veteran retired from the U.S. Marine Corps. His wife, Patricia, is an Elizabeth Dole Foundation Fellow and currently pursuing a doctorate in Homeland Security Management. They are recipients of a Habitat for Humanity home in Northern Virginia. As part of our community engagement efforts, we partner with local Habitat affiliates to literally make home possible. In fact, back in March, as part of Women's History Month, I had the great pleasure of participating in a Habitat for Humanity women build. So all the builds in March are staffed with female volunteers. So 10 of us showed up at this house, feeling pretty, well, I won't swear, it's first thing in the morning, and some of y'all are taping. And my kids will be like, Mom, do you swear? So, but you know what I'm thinking. So we get to build this house, and I have to tell you, well, I now know this. I got to caulk and paint hides the carpenter's mistake. And in this particular instance, the house that I worked on, our CEO had worked on a couple of months before, but don't tell him I said that. There were lots of things to see about. So I had the pleasure to sit down with the Ochon family to find out how do they feel about being the recipients of this Habitat home. And I asked them, what does home mean to you? Right? We asked that of anybody who does business with you, with Freddie Mac. What does home mean to you? And they said it's a sense of community. And it's what they said next that punctuated the importance of inclusive engagements for me. Patricia said, volunteers like Freddie Mac employees are putting love into our home. We are building a community with people we wouldn't have otherwise met. Our neighbors are more than people next door. They are everyone in this community. And I just thought that was a powerful way to talk about engagement, right? It's a community. How do we engage every member of our community? So, my hope is that these stories showcase that inclusion is not a program. Instead, it's a mindset, again, driven by the three things that we talked about. One, a willingness to ask important questions, actionable questions. Two, a culture that makes inclusion a leadership principle. And a commitment to search for and address bias systems. When done effectively, real, sustainable, and positive change can happen. As human resources leaders, our role is to advance an inclusive culture. As human beings, our role is to leave the world in better shape than when we found it, if only for a little bit. Thank you for your time, and I welcome your questions.
Awesome stories, I loved it. Quick question. One of the stories you mentioned was about the salary history. And you know, in my organization, we do it as well. So not just New York, but across the whole U.S. So I applaud you. But the question further down from that was, you said that you don't do it for internals as well. And I know
we do it for internal.
I mean, you do it for internals, and I don't want you to go over the whole business practice, but are there some issues that arise from that? Because maybe, person A, gets a 15,000 raise and person B only gets a 5, so there's no consistency because it's kind of all over the place, or have you seen anything like that?
So thank you very much for the question and the acknowledgement. So essentially the question really is around, do we create internal equity issues as a result, right? So there's a couple of things. One, internal equity issues exist even when you're just going outside, right? Every organization, there's sort of the patina of you got to leave and come back to get or earn the income that you think you deserve. So we're not creating anything. So in the same way that we manage any internal equity issues that are created by people coming back to the organization is how we manage it with internal mobility. So jobs are priced, and if we go out and look at the marketplace data and recognize a job family is pricing higher than we're paying, period, then that's a bigger question around what are we doing for that job family. Back to the earlier panel, Freddie Mac does do a pay equity analysis, and we address in spots whatever flare-ups we might see. I'm happy to report that we don't have any systemic sort of broad sweeping issues, but those things can happen just as a result of the ins and outs. So in many instances, we'll quietly know that someone going from one department to another department, those people in the receiving department should send that person a holiday card for the rest of their lives because they get this bump because of that move. We go, oh, actually, we need to remediate that we're behind market in this job category, and everybody actually needs to go up a little bit. So yes, you're going to see it. The question becomes, how do you want to remediate it if it's a significant enough problem? But the important thing to say, because there is resistance, is you create job or internal equity issues anytime you go outside to market. So it's no different. You're welcome.
Good morning, Jacqueline.
Good morning.
How has our current political landscape really shaped your discussion around diversity and inclusion? It's a hot topic, obviously, and you stand a risk of alienating somebody if you say really anything.
Right.
So how do you approach that?
Yeah, so I would say that it's notwithstanding the current political environment, it's always a little bit risky. So there are a couple of things in terms of how the sausage is made. So Freddie Mac is in conservatorship and has been since 2008 as an outcome of the economic downturn. And our conservator is FHFA. And FHFA actually has an OMWI office, an Office of Women and Minority Affairs. And we have goals that are actually tied to the government relative to how we run the business with respect to D&I. And so through our conservatorship, we have 3 categories, or we categorize our diversity efforts in 3 categories. One is workforce, the second is supplier, and then the third is what we call financial transactions. And that looks at the degree to which we use some of the larger firms to transact our capital market deals. So by government standards, we have thresholds to meet. What we're proud of is, in many respects, we have exceeded the targets even established by the government, and in many instances have pushed them to think more broadly about what potential impacts are. So that has not changed, even with the change in administration. And in fact, we just recently got a new FHFA director who hasn't done anything to change the direction of the previously established practices under OMWI. So we have to do it, but we take pride in the fact that we go beyond the things that we have to do.